Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Truth Booth. And I am super honored today to have one of my good friends with us who is going to share with you one of her struggles. And this is something that I want to do more often on the Truth Booth. From now on, I want to cover subjects that would help all of us to be more compassionate and maybe to know how to help in difficult situations in a better way. Because I know with me, it's a little difficult because sometimes I'm afraid of doing things the wrong way. So I'll admit that I just don't do anything at all sometimes. And so I want to get better at that. And I hope that you want to get better at that. So we are going to take a topic, a serious topic today, a painful topic today. And I want to introduce you to Holly. And Holly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Holly Clemente, and I live in Mexico. I've been living in Mexico for 19 years, and my husband and I are missionaries in Michoacan, and we've been married and ministering for almost 16 years this fall, and we have 6 children.
And the thing that we're going to talk about today has to do with children. And obviously you and your husband love children because you have 6 of them. You have a quiver full of them. But we're going to talk today about something that Holly has gone through, and that is miscarriage. And I would just like her to tell her story before we jump into some questions. So Holly, if you just want to briefly tell your story.
Sure. The briefly part is going to be hard,
That would be hard.
but I've tried to narrow it down a little bit. So it was actually 5 years ago this summer that we had a really busy summer planned, an international missions trip that we were leading, and a bunch of stuff going on at the church. And I remember that it was after a particularly busy weekend. We had an all-church conference, and we were in charge of the kids ministry all weekend. And we finished the weekend. We were all exhausted, including the kids who were with us the whole time. And so Monday morning, my husband and I woke up and we sort of snuck out to the living room, trying not to wake anyone else up, and got the coffee going and sort of sat down for a chat. And we were making all these plans for the summer, and we were expecting our 6th child at the time. And so we had a lot of plans surrounding that new baby that was going to be joining us. And then within a matter of hours, everything changed really quick. I ended up having a spontaneous doctor's appointment, which told us that the doctor was unable to find a heartbeat for the baby. And it changed the whole summer. It changed our lives forever. And that week we ended up going through a miscarriage. And it affected our whole family. The kids were very affected by it. And it really did change everything that happened from that point on.
I know there's a lot more detail, and I'm going to tell you now, and I'll tell you that I'm going to have the information for this in the description box. But Holly's written an amazing book that details this experience more and just takes you by the hand and walks with her through all the tragic things that happened during this, but really leading you down this amazingly holy path of what God did in their lives through this tragedy. So I really encourage you to read her book, and we'll show you that book at the end. And again, I'll put the link in the description here. But so that, I know that's a short version because I've heard the long version. And you really did make that very succinct, but I know it was painful, and there was a lot of painful decisions that had to be made. Just a very painful time. The reason why we want to have this discussion is because we want to better understand. Those of us who have not miscarried want to better understand what a person that has miscarried goes through, and then also how possibly we can help that, maybe help understand, help bring love and care, help be a support, have compassion, things to do, things not to do. So I just want to ask you a few questions just to help us understand. And I was thinking, I was talking to Holly earlier, I think all of us know somebody that has miscarried, or at least we know somebody that knows somebody. So this is something that I think is close to all of us. And so the information that we gather here today is going to be useful in our lives. But just to understand a little bit more, what kind of things were you fighting inside of yourself during that time?
Well, I think the big emotion that I felt was guilt. And it surprised me a lot because working in the ministry, I had counseled many other people, not necessarily through miscarriage, but through other types of loss. And with this particular loss, I was very sure in my head that I hadn't done anything to cause the miscarriage. But at the same time, the guilt was amazingly strong. And even though I told myself, that it wasn't my fault, I think as a mom, you always want to protect your child. And when you can't do that, you feel like you're a failure as a mother. And so I felt like at the most basic part of being a mom, that I had totally failed. And even though my mind told me that wasn't rational and that it wasn't my fault, it was still a very strong feeling that I had to really battle with.
What did that guilt sound like inside your head?
As I don't remember like a specific thought. I just remember feeling like a failure. I felt like, why didn't I know that there was something wrong with the baby? Why didn't I feel like, I don't know, maybe if I would have taken better care of myself, maybe if I hadn't been working so much in ministry and running around with all these other kids that weren't even mine, maybe there would have been a different outcome.
Is there anything that somebody could have, a good friend could have said, or to help you through that, or not really?
I don't think so. I think for me, it was something that I just sort of had to work through and sort of looking at the scripture, looking at God's word and getting my feelings to line up with that eventually. It was definitely a process. I don't know that anyone could have said anything to really help with that, because in my head, I knew that it wasn't my fault, but it did not stop the feelings.
Right.
So I think just as someone who's in an inner circle with someone who's going through miscarriage, they might not be able to say anything that will really help make those feelings disappear overnight. But I think just being there alongside a mom who's going through that kind of loss is so important.
Yeah. I think so often we think we need to say something. And a lot of times we don't need to say anything. We just need to be. That's really good. I know that miscarriage, everybody has a different story of that. So it's not like, oh, Holly's story is everybody else's story. But just as kind of a representative of women and families that have suffered the loss of a child in this way, what would you say is important for us to understand, those that are wanting to walk with you?
I think the biggest thing, and like you said, my experience does not represent and doesn't speak for everyone's experience. But for me, the thing that helped me most was for people to recognize the personhood of my baby. Before I experienced miscarriage personally, I always thought that it was such a tragic loss for anyone else who had been through it. But I don't think I really understood the depth of loss. I think when we haven't been through miscarriage, we think, oh, this teeny tiny baby that was with you just a few weeks or a few months. But we don't really realize the impact that life has on us as mothers. And it not only impacted me, but our whole family. And so it was really special to me when someone would, recognize that I had lost a baby and would even say that, because some people were even afraid to say that it was a baby, to say that it was really the death of a child. And so when people did say that, and I think some people are worried that those kinds of words are going to make the mother feel worse or feel really bad, because it sounds so tragic, but it is tragic. And so to have people use those specific words that recognize the life of my child and the life that had been lost, that was really helpful to me and very special to me as well.
A child that had already been born and had lived life a little bit, the same language that you would use for that, using that same language for someone that's had a miscarriage. That's really good.
Yeah.
That's really good. And I think too that a lot of times with things like that, we think it's so deeply personal that we feel like it's none of our business to be there or say anything, because it would be intrusive. Is that true?
I think a lot is going to depend upon the mother and personality, as far as if they want company or if they want people around right away. But I think, depending on the comfort level of the mother, I think we all want to feel validated in our feelings. When I miscarried, I experienced a lot of anxiety and almost fear of how strong my feelings of loss were. I sort of thought maybe I was the only one that had ever grieved this deeply for a baby that they had never gotten to hold. I think that having people come around you who validate that and validate the loss that you've lived through, I don't think they can really do anything wrong there. A mom who's grieving is always thinking about the baby that they lost. You mentioning it won't bring up all these extra bad feelings or sad feelings, because the mom's already there. She's already in that place of grief and thinking about her baby. And having you mention it is actually something that, at least for me, brought a lot of joy to my heart, because I felt like I wasn't alone in my grief.
What are some ways that people can care without being intrusive? Like maybe they don't need to show up on your doorstep even, or whatever, but I know too, it's really important that people like use a little bit of common sense. Like maybe the first few days or week, you don't want to show up on the doorstep unless you're very close, I think. But what can you do? What would be good to do?
Well, I think, like you said, common sense is very good. We live in Mexico, and Latin American culture is very hands-on. And I had people coming to my house the same day that, even before the actual miscarriage, the day that we heard the doctor's report that the baby did not have a heartbeat.
Wow.
We had people coming over, and I was okay with that because I have immersed myself in the culture here. But yes, definitely be sensitive. A lot will depend upon your relationship with the mom and with the family prior to the loss. But for me, I always think that you cannot go wrong with messages, text or messenger, or here we use WhatsApp a lot. And I think that lets the mom know that she's in your thoughts, she's in your prayers. But it also gives her the space she needs, whether or not she's ready to respond to that. And, a lot of people talk about this when referring to loss and grief, but oftentimes immediately after the loss is when people are sort of around and calling on the phone and sort of supporting the family. But it's in the months later, and even sometimes years later, that the mom is still thinking about her baby. She's still thinking about this loss and the grief that she carries in her heart. And that's often when people don't mention the child anymore, or don't mention the loss. And that can be even more difficult. So I think messages are great for that, whether a text or messenger or whatever, any kind of message. And even now with cell phones and caller ID, I think even a voicemail, a voice message, it sort of puts the ball in the mom's court, whether or not she's ready to pick up and answer, but she knows that you care.
What are some things that we should avoid saying? I know in these situations I've talked to so many people, and I think this is also what keeps me from wanting to say anything, because I don't want to say the wrong thing. But just what are some things that are not helpful to say in a message or in person?
Well, for me personally, I remember very clearly several people actually that came up to me after the miscarriage and asked if I was better yet. And that was not helpful at all. It totally ignored the loss of my baby, for one thing, sort of focused on me as if I were sick or had some other sort of problem.
Yeah.
And it just ignored the grief that I was feeling. It wasn't something that I could be better from. And people who try to put a spiritual spin on things like loss and grief, if you read my book, you know that the scriptures are very comforting and very helpful, but there are some scriptures that I think we use out of context when we don't know what to say sometimes. Like, God is working it all out for your good, or God will never give you more than you can handle.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things are sort of taken out of context.
Right, exactly.
And while their intent and the heart behind that might be true, it's not helpful. And as much as I was hanging on to God through the darkest days, those kinds of comments just felt like a slap in the face, the faith journey that I was going through because of the grief.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very important to focus on, you know, that God is there. God is with you, and he wants to hold you through the grief, and he wants to carry you through that. But not just throw out spiritual sayings or cliches to try to make it feel better, because it won't.
Chills and want to cry. Yeah. I think, going back to what you said before, why do you think that people don't treat miscarriage as a true loss?
I think there's maybe several different reasons. The big one for me, when I went through this miscarriage, not knowing what to expect, not knowing what was actually going to happen physically and emotionally. And so I was very hesitant at first to talk about my loss and what I was feeling, because I felt like so many other people have experienced much greater loss. And so I sort of was comparing it to other loss. And one thing that I've learned through this whole process and writing the book and just exploring my feelings with God as a part of my journey, you know, loss is loss and grief is grief. You know, even though everyone's experience is a little different, at the heart of it, it's still loss and it's still grief. And there are still going to be things that I've experienced that will apply to other people who have gone through maybe different kind of loss, but still it's a loss, and it's a death of a loved one.
And another thing I think too is, in any kind of grief, I know that we're guilty of trying to help people get over it. And what do you have to say about that?
I mean, even in my own mind, after the miscarriage, I sort of felt like there should have been a timeline. Like, I wondered if maybe I was grieving too hard. I don't know. There were times when I felt like, well, maybe it shouldn't be this bad anymore. The feelings shouldn't be this strong anymore. I think grief makes people uncomfortable. And so I think, sort of for our own comfort, we want to know that the other person is doing well. We want to know that the other person is doing better, is not feeling depressed, is not feeling anxiety that comes with grief. And so I think it's sort of a selfish thing, even though we wouldn't look at it like that. We would look at it, you know, as I love this person and I'm concerned about this person. But at the end of the day, I think it is sort of selfish in, you know, their grief sort of makes us uncomfortable. So we want to know that they're okay, so that we don't have to worry about them.
Right. That's really good.
Yeah.
We talked previously, and you talked about the importance of naming your baby. Can you say something about that?
Names have always been really important to me personally. And so whenever we went through a pregnancy, the name was always one of the first things that we talked about and chose, sort of as a blessing over our child and their life. And for me, naming the baby that we lost was really significant, because I think, again, going back to what I said earlier, recognizing the personhood of that baby was really important for me. And I have had other friends who have been through miscarriage since, and it's one of the number one, if I can say, recommendations that I give to someone going through that loss, because I think it's so important to recognize that that baby is a person, because if we don't recognize that, then it does seem like the grief is so exaggerated. So recognizing the importance of that baby, and I think it was super helpful to be able to identify that. Yeah. And my kids still talk about the baby and use the baby's name and talk about meeting the baby. We named her Avery, and they talk about meeting Avery in heaven someday. And I think it's really special that she has an identity.
You know, it gives us a cue to use that name too,
mm-hmm.
so that
Yes.
we can help with the grief process, the identity that this is a human child.
Yes.
This is a great loss.
Yes. Even now, 5 years later, and when someone uses the name Avery, you know, and talking about our loss, it just makes me feel really good inside. And my heart just overflows a little bit, because it's so special to me that someone else who never held the baby and never met the baby, but still remembers and recognizes that baby that we lost.
Well, you had 5 children at the time, right?
Yes.
How did you and your husband help your children work through the loss? Because when you get pregnant, your kids all know, they're excited, planning for the little brother or sister. How did you help them work through that loss?
That was really hard.
You have to deal with your own loss, but you had to deal with your children's loss too.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was really hard. My kids had prayed so hard for this baby, and the baby was the center of every conversation. Everything just revolved around our plans for the baby, and they would always check in and check my stomach and see how the baby was growing. And they were just so excited about this baby. And so I remember that coming home from my doctor's appointment, the day that our doctor told us there was no heartbeat, I remember thinking, how am I going to tell the kids about this without breaking down? I don't want to totally freak them out. I think it was important for them to see my grief. But at the initial announcement, I did not want to freak them out. I wanted them to feel safe enough to ask any questions that they had, and sort of try to help them process whatever they were feeling. Right. And so I remember my husband and I came home, and it's this trick I have when I don't want to cry. I dig my fingernails into the palms of my hands really hard, and it sort of gives me a focus point for the pain, so that like tears don't come out. So I remember doing that and just, you know, telling the kids, and they all cried, but they had tons of questions. And they were, you know, super honest questions that were going around in my mind. Yeah. I wasn't brave enough to voice yet, but they were asking, wait a minute, why didn't God heal our baby? Was God not there? Yeah. What happened? We prayed so hard for this baby. And what happened? So there were tons of questions. And then in my book, I share more about the story. I ended up miscarrying at home. And so the kids were all in the house while everything was going on. And it was a delicate balance. I wanted them to be able to grieve, and I wanted them to see my grief as well. But I wanted us to process it as a family. So my husband and I, we had the kids write letters to the baby. The kids all buried the letters with the baby. Every year since, on the day of the miscarriage, we have what we call Avery Day. It's not really so much about grief anymore. We celebrate what we learned from her being a part of our family, and what we learned through the loss about God. We do fireworks, and we have a special time of prayer and just sharing our thoughts about what we miss about not having Avery with us as part of our family, and what we look forward to telling Avery when we see her in heaven.
I love that. I love it. How God gives you the grace and the wisdom and the strength to lead your children so well in that way. Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's our good God. Can you just give us a brief summary of what you learned about God through this?
I think for me, I grew up in the church, and I grew up knowing about God. And one of the first songs you learn as a kid is "Jesus loves me, this I know." And I think the big takeaway for me through this whole experience was really experiencing the depth of God's love. I think we often think about love as like, it's like this feel good emotion, like this happy thing. But true love, and more importantly, God's love, isn't necessarily happy all the time. It doesn't necessarily feel good all the time. After the miscarriage and during this whole process of grief and loss, mourning the loss of my baby, I think I learned just how deep God's love is, that you can really go to the really dark, hard places, and he's still there. You really can't get outside of that love that he has for you. And so for me, that was the most precious thing, I think, was knowing that I could be in that really dark place and still feeling like I wasn't alone. You know, knowing that he was there with me, and that I could feel all of those terrifying, difficult emotions and still feel very safe in his love for me, and knowing that he was with me, and at the same time he was holding Avery at the same time. That was really a direct word from the Lord that happened right as I was actually miscarrying. It wasn't an audible voice, but I just felt like this whisper over me and the situation. And yeah, it was just God saying to me, you know, I'm holding you, and in these arms I have your baby too.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Such a powerful picture. Powerful picture. I just really want to recommend this. I recommend that you keep the link to this book handy for when someone you know goes through this. I recommend that everybody read this book, because it's going to help you with compassion, and also with knowing how to love a person grieving any kind of loss. But also, just Holly, your story just strengthened me in the Lord. Just totally strengthened me in the Lord. It's just beautifully written. You are so vulnerable. And just want to ask the question, like I said, again, I'll put the link to this right in the description box, so you can just click that. But I also wanted to ask you, what made you want to write about this and make it public?
It was scary for me, because, well, going back to what I said earlier, I did feel like maybe my loss wasn't as big or as tragic as others. And so I sort of felt like maybe it wouldn't be valuable for other people to hear my story. I was journaling a lot, so I didn't know that it was going to be a book at the beginning. But as I was writing, I just felt like, you know, even if this could only help one other person going through this, I just really like to share my experience, because I don't feel like it's so much my story as God's story.
And that's the
and what he was writing in my life. You know, it's God's story. It's valuable to everyone.
I love the name of the book, because I feel like that's what happens in all of our dark places. If we really let ourselves drive into God, into his word, who he is, it is a very holy place. I don't doubt one bit that this is going to be just a really beautiful and encouraging video for people to watch and then to share. We hope that you'll share this too, and we hope that you buy the book and that you buy another one for somebody else. So thank you so much, Holly.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about this story.
My pleasure, for sure. And we'll see you all next time.